Well, I think a lot of us knew this was coming. It was not looking good for Canoo for a long, long time, but it's official. They've declared bankruptcy, which is kind of the final nail in the coffin for most EV startups. This is the point in which the EV company basically sells off all of its remaining assets to try to pay off any remaining debt, but typically bankruptcy does mean that there's no fiscal way for them to actually pay off all the debt they have, so it's over. It's not happening. It means that Canoo is not delivering any more EVs. Not that they delivered much in the first place, but I think it's natural at this stage in the development game where another EV startup bites the dust for us to go, okay, what went wrong here? It's obviously very difficult to make a successful EV startup. It's difficult in general to run any automotive company. Even the car companies that have been around for over 100 years are still struggling to turn a profit. It is not an easy business. But the truth is, with Canoo, I think there was a multitude of reasons for things not going well. There were lots and lots of poor decision making and not clear leadership on what the future of the company would be. And I was a pretty big fan of Canoo. I've been talking about them for years on this channel. I was even, for a time, a shareholder, which, yes, I learned a valuable lesson about EV stocks that way. Thankfully, all of my gains from Tesla stock easily covered my Canoo losses. I didn't put that much in, but yes, I pretty much lost everything that I put in there. And if I were to look over the history of the company as I followed Canoo from pretty much the beginning, I would narrow it down to three major issues that went wrong that led to this inevitable bankruptcy that they have now filed for. And for one, it comes from not having enough focus. So if you remember following Canoo in the old days, they originally didn't even plan on selling their lifestyle vehicle, which is this bubble toaster looking EV on wheels. There was even a time where Apple was in talks to buy them, if you can believe it. Maybe Apple saw that this was going nowhere before we all did. And there were talks that Canoo was going to partner with Hyundai for a while. There was some rumblings of that, didn't really go anywhere, but in the early days with that lifestyle vehicle, they were just planning to turn it into a service, like it was a membership system where you would just rent one out for a day or a week or even a year if you felt like it, and obviously the rates and the prices would be better if you were leasing it out over the course of a year versus just a few days. But they had a very, very radical approach to their business model of, we don't want to sell cars, we just want to build a few of these things and rent them out to people as needed, because they thought, I guess, that was the future. I remember in the early days their prototypes even had just like a place for your smartphone, and for a while that was basically going to be the only display in the whole thing. You just docked your phone somewhere and your phone was going to launch the Canoo app, and that would have your speedometer, your gears, and all your navigation so that they didn't have to put a display on the interior. But there was a change in leadership several times at Canoo, and obviously later on they decided, you know what, actually we are going to sell these vehicles to individuals. We're going to be like just any other automotive company. But still, any time of pivoting, anytime you have a change in direction like that, it means you probably had a lot of time and money designated towards one business model, and you probably got some investors on board with that concept. But then when you pivot, you confuse a lot of your investors and also a lot of your staff, because they were like, wait, I thought we weren't going to have to go through the process of figuring out how to sell vehicles to individuals and have to go through a certain level of paperwork or legal requirements. So that creates its own problem. And also that change in direction, or that pivoting that the company goes through, also applies with your product lineup itself. If you remember in the old days, Canoo had a multi-purpose delivery van, which kind of looked like a cyber van, if you will. And a lot of people really liked that idea. I was quite compelled by it, and I thought, oh, hey, that might be cool, like food trucks that are all electric, right? They need to use power anyway. So I was getting excited by all the potential of the product line that Canoo was unveiling, but I've learned now from following other EV startups over time that sometimes having too many different products that you're trying to develop at once can be very costly, it can be very expensive, and it can create a lot of distractions in the short term, which is not good for a young startup that has limited capital. And that's something that I think the newer EV startups are a lot more wary of. I think that's part of the reason Fisker failed. You know, they started with the Ocean, but they were having these events and these unveilings for smaller vehicles and pickup trucks, and they were having to spend all of this money developing prototypes and having to hire designers to help them design the interior, the exterior. I also believe Nikola had a similar problem, but somehow they're still around. But when Trevor Milton was in charge of Nikola, he was like, oh yeah, we're going to do hydrogen pickup trucks and hydrogen semi-trucks and also jet skis and off-roading vehicles, and there's just too much you're throwing at the wall at the same time. But I think what Aptera has figured out and what Tello is learning from all of these failed startups is it really, really helps for you to go all in and zero in on on just one product. In fact, it's particularly helpful if that one product you're focusing on has some kind of competitive, compelling edge to it that helps separate it from everything else on the market. But that's more of a transition in this video to point number 2 as to why Canoo failed. But my last point in flaw number 1 is that Canoo was trying so many different models at the same time, right? They had their lifestyle vehicle, they had their multi-purpose delivery vehicle, then they had the Bulldog, and they had the pickup truck for a while. Then they were pivoting their lifestyle vehicle to be more of a delivery van, and then they had an extended version of that for the postal service. And at the same time, they were toying around with a sedan variant. There was just so many different models that they were toying around with simultaneously, and I think that showed that they didn't have great focus. And it leads me into flaw number 2 with the company. Nothing about the Canoo really set it apart that much from everything else on the market. I mean, most would look at the company and admit the most unique thing about it is the look, the design, which, okay, that's something. I guess it's a bit more unique looking than a Fisker Ocean or, say, a Lordstown Endurance, which was just kind of like, hey, here's another pickup truck, or here's another SUV. The Canoo looked unique in some regard, but my main issue with it is the look didn't really unlock much of an advantage for them, right? Like, the Aptera is very different looking, but it's not just different for the sake of being different. The Aptera looks very radical and very different because it unlocks all kinds of efficiency numbers. You can't get 10 miles per kilowatt hour and not have a vehicle look like that. Or same thing with the Tello truck. It looks very different from every other pickup truck, but it all comes down to having to fit in a very, very small form factor. Like, nobody else can fit in the footprint and unlock those same specifications, a 5-foot bed and 5 seats. And the Canoo, okay, it does have this kind of bubbly toaster look to it, and it's interesting that there's not really a hood anymore. I guess you could argue that that unique design enabled very, very good driver visibility. You know, they could look right in front of them, and there wasn't really a frunk space anymore, but that particular shape that they were keeping consistent across all their different product offerings, it was not particularly aerodynamic. I mean, it's kind of like a flat wall that the air is hitting at highway speed, and I guess it gracefully goes over the top, but if you go through AirShaper, if you go through wind tunnel testing with that Canoo look, it doesn't particularly give you great efficiency. It's not more efficient than a Model Y. It's probably not even that much better than a Rivian, and that means you're still having to use fairly large battery packs and not get that great a range. Maybe you could argue it helps you unlock a very different interior design where people are sitting on the sides or on the back, and perhaps you could argue this is a cheaper way to have a 7-seater, but again, pretty niche advantages were unlocked by this design, which I admit was cool, and I appreciate that Canoo was trying to do something different, and that's what initially attracted me to it. It was like, you know, I want the future to look like the future, and I don't believe the future of electric vehicles is just slapping batteries in our existing vehicle footprints. That's why I was particularly not that interested in the Fisker Ocean, because I was like, okay, you're just like every other SUV, or the Lordstown Endurance. I was like, okay, another F-150 looking truck that just happens to have batteries in it. Not that interesting, not that radical, and same logic, I'm afraid, applies to the Canoo. It's like, yeah, I don't think rearranging the seating layouts or unlocking slightly more visibility for the driver is a big enough reason for people to consider wanting that vehicle over another. So that was probably an issue with investors, and that change in direction for the company, and part of the issue with a company not having an extreme focus on one product and keep changing the product depending on which fleet buyer you can find, is that investors get confused, and that's also probably why Canoo went public way too early. They likely thought they were going to deliver at higher volumes, and of course, once you're a publicly traded company, all of your worst financials are out in the open, and you gotta do all these shareholder voting systems with the public. It's not a good situation. So I think the Canoo footprint, you know, it's cool that it was steer-by-wire, and it was cool that it looked different, but that wasn't really enough to set it apart from its competition, and the investors probably knew that the demand for the vehicle offerings they were showcasing was not all that high in the first place. And that brings me to flaw number 3 that was probably the ultimate killing blow to the company, and I hate to say this because it could potentially start some drama, but I think most of the internet agrees with me. Poor leadership. At least if you go online, it's very clear that shareholders and fans of the Canoo brand are quite upset with the most recent CEO using company funds to buy his own private jet and use that for his own personal gain. You know, maybe he could argue it was good for trying to find investors or going to political events, because Canoo near the end there was definitely trying to align with all kinds of state governments and federal governments, trying to win over a lot of political money or political funding, I think. But Tony Aquila has got a lot of negativity negativity around him in the press, and everyone is convinced that he was hoarding a lot of investor money for his own personal gain, and that, of course, is not good for the company, and there are receipts for a lot of these expenses that he used and put on the company card or made the company paid for, which is really a shame and really sad to see because, you know, there's a lot of people that put their own hard-earned money into this business, and he definitely appears likable in most of the videos he's appeared with. You know, he's been in Monroe Live videos, and he feels like a fairly reasonable, fairly happy guy, but there's all kinds of skeletons in the attic with him when it comes to using the company's funds inappropriately, and that, of course, will absolutely kill any startup company or even well-established automotive company. If you have poor leadership and poor management that is misusing company funds, that is a non-starter and definitely a quick way to kill a company. So it's those three things that stem down to not having a clear mission or a clear product portfolio and having the company continuously pivot every couple of months to figure out how to secure more deposits. And also second, the products themselves not standing out in any particular useful way doesn't give them a competitive edge over a very competitive market. And third, company mismanagement from poor leadership and misuse of funds, I think, are the main reasons that Canoo is now filing for bankruptcy, and this officially kind of puts them to bed. It's a shame because I'm sure there were a lot of people that were working really hard on these products and really cared about them, and I think there were probably a lot of people at the company that genuinely wanted to see these vehicles deliver at scale, and they did deliver at fairly low volume to a few different fleet buyers and fleet customers, but for the most part, it's just another example of how it's not easy to make a startup EV company. And I want to really highlight near the end of this video that both Aptera and Tello are paying attention to the startups that don't make it, and they're looking at exactly what went wrong, what is the biggest mistakes going on with these startup companies, and how do we avoid making the same mistakes. You know, I think another potential issue that led to Canoo's bankruptcy was they were trying to do almost all of the manufacturing themselves. You know, they had their own factory, which requires a lot of capital, a lot of upfront money that you could easily not have available because you spent too much on private jets or on prototypes, and that's why Tello is not going to be making the same mistake. They're looking for contract manufacturing so that they don't have to front up as much capital as Canoo did. And I also think it's worth mentioning that while Aptera is the type of company that a lot of people critique for delaying production, or, oh my god, they haven't delivered a vehicle yet, and so many people out there have this notion, including Marquez on his latest autofocus video, that a company isn't real, a company is pure vaporware until production and deliveries begin. And you can tell in his video that he considers Canoo more valid or more real simply because they have delivered a few vehicles. It's not at high volume, but a lot of people are like, okay, you're not a real company until you deliver a product. But the truth is, we've seen this with Fisker, we've seen this with Lordstown, and now we've seen it with Canoo. Sometimes premature production and deliveries are actually what kill the company. If you're not thinking through what you're mass producing, if you're not designing it properly, and if you're not securing the right amount of deposits properly, then actually that obsession with delivering, be like, let's not think about all that, all we need to do is focus on deliveries. As long as we deliver, then every other problem will take care of itself. Some people have that obsession and just think we need to deliver a product, and they deliver it early or they deliver it too soon, and it's actually that early production or early delivery process that looks good short-term in the press because they get to say, okay, it's not vaporware, technically we delivered a product. It's that exact obsession that can end up killing the company because they didn't think it through, they rushed the product, they rushed production, and that's why I still consider Aptera and Tello just as real or just as much of a company as these other EV startups because they're thinking these things through. They're trying to design from the ground up to be manufacturable, they're trying to be very strategic, and they're trying to be very careful with how they start production and start deliveries because they know from all these other failed EV startups that you can do it too quickly and that will end up killing you. And I hope that Canoo can be another lesson to people that, hey, I know it sucks when a company delays their first deliveries, but they might just be a bit more strategic about it, and a company might survive a lot longer if they take their time, iron out the product, iron out the assembly line, and make sure that when they enter the market for real, they do it properly and they don't kill the company in the process, because this has happened time and time again, and it will probably happen again. But I'm not trying to say that there's a guaranteed path to success with any EV startup. It's very difficult, especially finding the right funding, but I hope something can be learned from all you viewers and also all these other EV startups out there with what went wrong with Canoo in particular. What do you guys think was the main flaw with the company that led to its ultimate bankruptcy? Feel free to comment down below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.